The lens is the question of what I call intimacy and otherness, which is a way of saying, I'm trying to think what kind of translations I can offer that give you the feeling of what the words intimacy and otherness. So sources sheets are here. I'm thinking of a human being's experience of his own, her own interior. That is your inner life, your inner world, that which belongs to you and which you presumably know. You're aware of what's going on inside you, as opposed to the otherness of the world. That everything outside you, well, maybe you feel feelings of love for what's outside you, or maybe you feel feelings of hate or fear. You know, there are primal feelings that have to do with the relation between the self and the other. And Freud had a lot to say about this. The movement of love, the movement towards the other. One of the ways he talks about it very simply in terms of the human organism is the instinct to eat. Your imagination has to take a leap. That is, I want to bring it into me, that thing out there, and I want to have it inside me. That's what it means to eat. So that's the infant whose first instinct is to take in the milk that comes outside, from the breast of the mother, and take it into herself, let's say her, since we are all her, I assume, and make it part of me. It becomes intimate to me. The milk belongs to the baby in the end. And the baby gets the first sense of that so important transaction with the world, which will then play out not just in terms of feeding later on, but in terms of taking nurturance from the world, taking nourishment, taking intellectual nourishment, taking spiritual nourishment, all kinds of metaphoric playoffs of that idea of taking what is strange, it doesn't belong to your body, but you love it, you want it in some way, and you open it, it's called desire, that's what we call desire, and we take it into ourselves. You could say that that's the movement. The Hebrew term for it, the classic term for it, is chesed or rachamim, which is the instinct to join the inside and the outside, so there should be no barrier. Whether it means going out towards the outside or taking the outside into you, the end is, the bottom line is that the boundaries are blurred. That you don't obey boundaries between the self and the other. And so intimacy, if that is the law of life, if that were the only law of life, well, you might say that would be a blessed affair. That would be a wonderful affair where people go around without a sense of limits, without a sense of boundaries, and just merge with each other, quietly, happily, take each other in. I wouldn't say the problem is, but just the interesting thing is that that's not the way we're made. There is another impulse as well. And the other impulse is to recognize the boundaries and to feel all kinds of complicated emotions towards what is outside us. And sometimes we're afraid of it. It threatens us, it impinges on us, it makes us feel overwhelmed, it imposes itself on us, all kinds of ways of putting it. This is all before we get to our material. This is by way of laying the ground, translating into very simple primal terms, physical, sensual terms. That's what I'm interested in. How can you translate spiritual ideas in the end, din and rachamim, rachamim and din, rachamim and gvura. These are Kabbalistic terms. I don't know who I'm talking to, so I don't know what your experience is, but I'm sure I will find out. I'm not going to ask for shows of hands now, but I assume that the basic meanings are available to you and probably more than that. So the idea then that limits mean something. They keep you safe. They keep you distant. They mean you don't have to actually fight the other. If you just keep a distance, you recognize I am not you. And so there could be two ways of getting it wrong, this balance. One would be of not recognizing the limits and thinking that you can happily go and treat everyone else, putting it on a very simple level, treat everyone else as if they were just an extension of you. and they have the same inner network as you have. They have the same inner working exactly as you have. And that's one of the mistakes that one makes. That's not an unusual mistake. The other mistake is if I'm, in general, I prefer not to have questions during class. There'll be time at the end, I hope. But unless there's something you really don't understand, unless there's something that, what? And then, of course, so that would be one mistake. And the other mistake would be to be so impressed by boundaries, by yirah, by fear, as it's called in the Kabbalistic term, that pulls you away from the other. Right? It's a magnetic force going the other way, repel, that you lose life, that you're never filled up by the other. You never fill the other. And so that would be the two extreme ways of getting things wrong. And in between, there's a whole life, all the lives of human beings in the world, you could say, work between these extremes. In Kabbalistic terms, the Avot and the whole narrative of the Torah pivots on these two principles. And certainly the Avot, when we start with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And what I want to look at now, without further ado, is I want to go into the story of Avraham and the way in which he first appears to us as a subject, as someone who has an inner life, presumably. And that is Lech Lecha, of course, the moment of Lech Lecha, which is introduced at the beginning of our Parsha, Vayomer Hashem el Avram. God speaks to Avram. Of all people in the world, he chooses Avram and he says to him, Lech Lecha me'artzecha me'moladetecha me'beit avicha. Get going, Lech Lecha. Go, but not just Lech, it's Lech Lecha. The whole Midrashic tradition, up to Rashi and beyond, picked up in the Hasidic traditions, give weight to the word Lecha. Say it must mean something. What does it mean? Go, what? Why is that word added? Ramban, for instance, and Baalei Pshat, people who just want to read the Torah as you would read any book. Let's just say like that. You read it. Understand that Lecha is a figure of speech. It's just a way of adding a little zest, a little energy to the movement. Like you say, kum Lecha. Yeah, brach Lecha. If you're familiar, it's just so. It's in Greek. It's called an Enclitic. An Enclitic is just a little word that actually means nothing, but it's a stylistic frill. It just gives you a feeling of energy. That there's some. So you don't have to so he dismisses basically all the overworked things that the Midrash says and the Hasidim, well, he's before the Hasidim, but there were Hasidim in all generations. I want to say, since I'm on the side of the Midrash in this, and that's what I'm going to, that the Torah is poetry, that the Torah is not prose, or perhaps putting it more carefully, it can be read as prose, and it can also be read as poetry. And yet it's written in the Torah itself. At the end of the Torah, Moshe reads out to the people all the words of this song. It called Divrei Hashira Hazot. And that, again, can have two meanings. Now, the fact that you can have two meanings for so many things, or more than two, already suggests poetry. If you just look at the history of commentary, you see that it can't be as simple as just reading a prose passage that is very factual and historical, and you learn facts from it. The fact is, it can be read in many different ways. And the form of writing that is most that way, that is most flexible and multi-layered, is poetry. And so there is a tendency to say, Divrei Hashira Hazot, the words of this song, refers to the Torah itself, the whole Torah. Again, the other side says, no, it just refers to Ha'azinu. Right? The end of the Torah is a song. That clearly is a song. And it just refers locally to that. So you can see already there's an expansive view, an expansive way of reading Torah, and there is a limiting way in the interests of cogency, in the interests of clarity, of not going off the deep end, and getting away from the text. There are a lot of virtues associated with both ways of reading, I would say. And I'm not here to do a caricature of Pshat. Pshat can contain a great deal and is a discipline. But then there is the other thing. And the other thing, chesed. What does it say in Eshet Chayil there? Chesed al-Lashona, Torah chesed al-Lashona. That the law of chesed is on her lips, on her tongue, right? It can mean simply she's a very kind person. And so she speaks in the language of chesed. Or it can actually mean that is Torah. Torah is Torah chesed. And the Eshet Chayil has access to that kind of Torah. And not only the Eshet Chayil, but she excels at that. Anyway, let's not get too far afield. I want still to get to our material. What are we come in the middle of things in Lech Lecha. Clearly, it's not the beginning of the story of creation. We've already a lot of water, literally, has gone under the bridge before we get to Abraham. 20 generations of people who lived, had children and died, lived, had children and died. That's the basic facts of human life. Punctuated by a mabul, which puts an end to all life in the world. Why is an end put to all life? And here there's a tremendous, I want to just say one thing about that story that we're not going to get a chance to study, because it's before we begin. Right, we begin in the middle, in a sense, with the story of Avram. The situation of the Mabul is a situation, theologically speaking, as far as human beings is concerned. Their social lives are described as very corrupt, very cruel. Words are used that mean social evil, Hamas, the way of behaving to one another, including incest, which, if you think about it, has something to do with chesed gone overboard. No limits, no, right? Incest is that. But when the way we read it in the Torah, interestingly, doesn't just say, so God decided to destroy the world. It could have been said very simply, as it says, and God decided to create the world. Vayomer vayehi. So it could be here, Vayomer vayehi, and it happened. Instead, what do we have? We have a whole build-up at the end of Parshat Bereshit with Vayinachem Hashem ki asa et ha'adam, that God was sorry. Yinachem, strange word. He thought again. He had troubled thoughts, very anthropomorphic, about the fact that he had created the human being at all. That the whole project comes under question for God. And suddenly we're taken in a way that we have to be astonished at every time, I think. We're taken into the mind of God, which is very unusual in the Torah. Later in the Torah, there's a focus on the human life and how God impinges on human life, how his laws and so on. But suddenly we're taken into God's workplace, into God's study. God is looking at God's work, what shall I say, his studio, where he created, and he doesn't like what he created. And he changes his mind about it. And then it says, Vayit atsev Elokim. And God was saddened to his heart, again, about this project. And I want to say that kind of word used of God, has to draw attention to something that normally, it doesn't fit into the realm of history, of how you would tell empirical history. What happened at that point in the world? That takes you into not only the mind of God, but it takes you into his emotions, as if it's highly anthropomorphic. It's not a question just of the kind of things that can trouble one. What does it mean God came down, and what does it mean God went up, and God sitting, God standing, God doesn't have a body. That's baby stuff. The real stuff is this, what you have at the beginning of the Torah. It's as if at the beginning of the Torah, the spotlight is on God and on God's intentions and God's disappointment. And that's, of course, difficult stuff theologically. What are we supposed to make of it? After all, theologically, the principles of faith don't allow for that kind of thinking. But there it is. There it is in the Torah, and it's undeniable that there was a moment, a pang of great sadness. Vayit atsev. What caused the sadness, Rashi says? And so now the oral law comes into play and brings in the later traditions. Doesn't make it better at all. Actually plays on the anthropomorphism. What made God sad? Ha'adam ala b'machshavto. God, human beings came up in God's mind. And when God thought about the human being, the human project, then he was made sad. God was made sad by the entry of another, the human being, into his mind. A moment of disillusion, a moment of depression, a moment of, I would say, disappointment, very simply. I had high expectations and it was not. And suddenly we're taken, now I'm emphasizing the shock value of this expression. We shouldn't just read it, as you do when you're half asleep. There's something there. Why does the Torah do that? Shouldn't we think of God as totally other? In every way in which we are human, we are not like God. No. In many ways, deep and complicated ways in which we are human, God is described in a mirroring way. And don't ask theological questions. It's for the purposes of entering somewhere into deep truths that cannot be described in any other way, but through what I'll call the sensual, through the material, because that's where we live. We live deep in the depths of things, not floating over the surface and able to say, oh, yes, God, almighty, all powerful, and human beings. It's not as clear as that. I'm ready to trouble that sense of that God, Hasidim used to, some Hasidim, tzaddikim used to daven in compassion for God, in a strong sense of fellow feeling with God for his suffering in the way the world is, over the way the world. Now, is that out of bounds? Where do you get the right to do that? But it starts here. It starts in Rashi and his midrashic sources. God was nit'abel al ovdan ma'aseh yadav. He was in mourning. That's what it means, vayit atsev. It's a translation. It's not just sadness. He was in mourning over the loss of the work of his hands. It's not on your source page yet. That is, he had made something with his hands. And what kind of thing was it? It was Adam. And when your attention is focused on God's creative activity, then suddenly it's no longer just, God mystically and in an unembodied way, just God said and it was. Na'aseh Adam, let's make man, and then man came into being. But it includes the actual making of man. And how did God make man? According to the imagery in the Torah itself. Right? In Perik Bet, what do we have? We have that God met by Yitzer Hashem Elokim et ha'adam min ha'adama. That God took the earth, the soil, right? Afar, it's called, the dust of the earth, and molded it into a human being. Now, you can't do that with dry earth, right? You can't mold with something dry. And you need, of course, water. And here is a radical image that's there in the Torah, and Rashi emphasizes it. What do we have? We have, previous to that, a description suddenly, after the first creation story is finished. We have a description of how there was before Adam was created, there was no terem yed. It's Perik Bet Pasuk Hey, if you have a Chumash, which I warmly recommend you bringing. Perik Bet Pasuk Hey. V'chol siach hasadeh terem yeh ba'aretz. All the vegetation of the field had not yet appeared on the earth. V'chol esef hasadeh terem yitzmach, and all grass in the field had not yet sprung forth. That strange word terem. That is, you look at the world and it's barren. There is nothing there. Now, how could that be? After all, it was on the third day that God commanded the world and said, Tacheh ha'aretz deshem, let the world bring forth its grass, its vatotze. And then the next verse says, of course, as you expect, that the world obeys, that the grass does grow. And now suddenly we come in close. It's like a zoom, excuse me, right? It's a zooming in. And you say, oh, well, actually, no. Let's revise what we just read. No, there was no grass. What do you mean? God said. And there Rashi will offer this Midrash. It's from the Gemara in Chulin. Very powerful and very significant, in which what we have is this. We have the idea that God said, let there be grass, and the grass grew, of course, but only up to the petach karka, only up to the surface of the earth, and it halted its growth right there beneath the surface. And there it is in a state of arrest, not coming through, not fulfilling God's commandment. Why? Pasuk continues, Ki lo himtir, because God had not yet sent rain. So you need the rain to make the vegetation come through. And then why no rain? Because there was no man, Adam Ayin. There was no human being to work the ground. Now, Pshat, the prose meaning of that, is that before the creation of man, you didn't have the agricultural conditions for producing vegetation. So even God's command, to some extent, has to conspire with human energy and human activity. Wait till there is a human being who's capable of working the ground. Now that's a very workable, right? It's a very practical, pragmatic reading. So that's the basic meaning. But that's not what Rashi says. Again, he has recourse to the Gemara in Chulin. It says this: why did the grass not come through, the vegetation not come through? Ki ein Adam, because there is no human being lahakir betovatam shel hageshamim. There can't be rain because there is no human being to appreciate rain. There is no human intelligence and sensibility. We're not talking now about the ability to actually plow the ground. We're talking about someone who is born into a world in which he realizes that something important is missing, that God's will is not being done. And it depends somehow, a demand is made of him. And what is the demand? What is it he feels without any commandments, without anyone telling him? He feels that he has to pray, leitpalel, which is an act of levakesh rachamim, to ask for mercy, to ask for levakesh rachamim. That is rachamim for the world, rachamim for everything. Right? It's a total instinct that I can and should speak to the source of all being, that I can in some way affect reality, even on such a catastrophic level. You know, it's a level of, it's a possibly tragic level where you suddenly see that it's not working. And then you're called on, perhaps in sheer despair. Perhaps it can be not in such a hopeful mode, to cry out to God. And God desires the prayers of the righteous. I'm quoting from the Midrash. What is it that God wants out of this world? He wants the act of prayer here. He wants the act of tefillah, till there's a human being who recognizes ayin, who can look at the world and realize that the good and the importance of things in the world is not working as well as it should. Tovatam shel gshamim. There can be no rain. And God is waiting then for the prayer for rain. Now, you have to think now, you have to use your imagination. A human being now, this is the poetic view, in which you don't just look at the facts. and get your arms ready to work the ground. And that's all that's needed. But you have an inner world of reactions and responses and wonderings. What is going on? And complexity. You don't know what the answer is exactly at the beginning. And so there's an instinct then to speak to God and to desire in words, to express your desire in words. And without that, the world can't get going. The world can't. And so there is rain. And his la'avod, his working the ground, has to do with avodah in this reading. It has to do with the worship of God and with a relationship with God. So it has to do with human beings and the divine. That's the basic. As I'm speaking, of course, I'm aware of all kinds of contemporary situations that we have known and we have been in recently, in which we know perhaps a little more about this than we once did. Things that are not so easy to talk about. But let's go on now. If the rain fell, we go back now to the story, then you had water. And then immediately after that, it says God formed. So God formed the man out of what? Out of the clay of dust and water. Now that's, of course, molding, forming. That is that work, in which you get your hands into something. If you've ever done work like that, it's not sculpting, where you are looking for a perfect form, and you do it by chipping away at stone and get rid of stuff, and there it is. And you recognize that's one way of thinking of the creative act, the imaginative act. But a much deeper way of thinking about it is thinking about someone who is working two elements, a dry and a wet one, mixing them together, combining them, and working them and forming them and then deforming again, and going through all kinds of, that's what we call work. Right? Work is actually to keep working at something. It's not just to achieve a simple goal. It's to address a complex reality. It's dust and water, dry and wet. And the idea is to combine them and see what you can make happen. That's the image that's used of God's disappointment. That God is disappointed, al ovdan ma'aseh yadav. We take that very loosely. The loss of the work of his hands. The work of his hands is that. Right? It's not sculpture, it's, what would you call it? What's the word for it in English? That kind of work? Ceramics, yeah. Have you ever had the experience of this? Yeah. One sabbatical year, I did it just for the experience, just because I wanted to understand something about this image from the inside. And that's the advantage of this kind of work. Because that plumbs the depths of the human imagination and the human fantasy, that you can go into the material. This is real material you're working with. There's nothing airy-fairy about it. You're not looking for a perfect shape. You're looking for the matter. You're getting your hands in the matter and you're working with it. And it's something, of course, that children have from very early. That instinct, right, in somewhat unmentionable ways as well, right, to get to, right, that instinct, that is the way God created human beings. And in the end, he says, this form won't work. No problem. We'll just destroy it, and we'll just unform it and try again, which is just what the Bible represents. As I have to ask a question. Can you tell me how many of you understand the Hebrew words I use? Can you give me a sense? Put your hands up. I think I should translate. I think everyone, yes? Okay, good. So I don't have to try. I'm sure you're way ahead of, of what I'm implying here, but I'll get to know. That where was I? Working stuff that turns into a form. God says no, doesn't work. The hand knows things. The hand can be disappointed. If you've really worked at things from the inside, then you have an intimate view, right? That you're expressing the intimacy, right? The deep inwardness of yourself. You're not just looking for a pretty picture out there. You're looking to express yourself. And you know when it's not working. You know that, no, not that one. And somewhere that's what God is doing. So there's a sense here of provisional forms at the beginning. Even before God created man, according to the Midrash, he created many worlds and destroyed them. What an image of God. And then it came to this world, and then this one also. And it has to do with the issue of work and with a particular creativity that's involved in human terms when we work with material which resists us. It's not you don't want to work with something that's too fluid and too pliable. It should be pliable, but not too pliable. You know, you're proud of the material if it resists you a bit. Somewhere there's something positive about it. And that, I think, is also true of the divine work and the way in which we create things. It's the resistance that creates the movement. So essential to this process then is ambivalence, getting to know one's own inner ambivalence, that I feel hate for this and I feel love for this, that in some way this shape threatens me. You know, this what I'm coming up with here, it frightens me, it's monstrous. Will I destroy it or will I carry on? What will I do now? So in purporting to talk about God, it's really talking about human beings and letting us know how we live, what the creativity of human beings depends on. It depends largely on what we'll call the unconscious. That is, on things that are so deep inside us that they can't be accessed in any other way, I would say, than by a form of creativity. That somewhere our dream lives bring us to those things, to those depths, unless you've done psychoanalysis or one of the more formal ways of trying to. But in general, what human beings do is that they create things that are in a way other, something else. It's not in me, but in it I express not only something out there, but something from in here. And there are combinations here. So I think it's high time now to look at Lech Lecha. Have a look at number 1 on your page. Now does someone have a very clear watch? Thank you. My watch is not very clear and the clock is not working. So as far as I'm concerned, it's 12:05, which I realize it's not. Thank you very much. Okay. So what do we have now? Lech Lecha, leave everything that you know, very clear what you're to leave. Your home, your land, your birthplace, house of your father. All the circles of your being, the containers of yourself, of your being in the world. And go el haaretz asher areka, to the land which I will show you. What is famously not said here is the destination. And around that, right, there is quite a tale to tell. What do the commentaries make? What does the Midrash make of the unknown destination? When you go on a journey, particularly as journeys are known, they're a byword in the ancient world, certainly, for difficulty and danger and risk. No one goes on a journey just for the fun of it. And here God is commanding Abraham to go on a journey. Lecha. How does Rashi translate it? Have a look at Rashi's. This is where we start now, and I'm going to be moving quite quickly now. Lech lecha lehanatcha uletovatcha. I'm asking you to do this difficult thing, to detach yourself, detachment, the Buddhist ideal of detachment from everything that's familiar to you, that's intimate to you, and go off into another sphere. And I'm not telling you where. Know that it will be for your benefit and for your good. That's how Rashi translates the pivotal word of our whole meeting, which is lecha. Go for you. That's how it's translated. Not to you, but for you. We'll get to you. Go for you. it'll be for your good. But the words that are used here, especially hana'ah, has a very practical, not to say economic meaning. Hana'ah is when you get real benefit, actual practical benefit from things. It's on a very real basis. It's not you will be enriched by the journey. And that Rashi gives examples of what he means, that God means by that. For instance, if you stay here, if you don't travel, you will never have children. And we know already that Avram's wife is barren. It's not said that he couldn't have children. It's said that she couldn't. But since they are one, since clearly this is the marriage, and we're not into anything else yet, the idea is then what Abraham starts Lech Lecha childless. Ariri, as he later calls it. Ariri, terrible word. Ariri with the meaning of raised, R-A-Z-E-D, a ruin in which buildings are uprooted, subverted from the base. He's living in a rootless world in which there is no root in him for the future. He can't create, as all the thoughtless generations have been creating since the beginning of time. Everyone else has been having children. That's the description of the course of a life. It culminates in replacing yourself and death. And he has not done that. And here God says to him, well, if what you have to do is, right, you have a kind of, this is your fate. You can improve your fate by your destiny in the world by going there to Eretz Yisrael. The purpose is to get there, the destination. But it doesn't say, of course, Rashi doesn't deal with the question right away of, so why does God not tell him where? If the main thing is you will have children in Eretz Yisrael, but not here, then surely should have said right away, Eretz Yisrael, which was in any case where his family were going before Lech Lecha. Terach, his father, had taken the family and gone halfway to Eretz Yisrael from Ur Kasdim, and then for some reason stopped halfway in a place called Haran. This is all before Lech Lecha. And then the next Rashi, Ve'escha legoy gadol, right? Not only will you have a child, but children, but I'll make you into a great nation. And here Rashi addresses, again from the Midrash, the need for a special blessing of this kind, because in general, traveling mima'etet priya uruvia. Rationally speaking, there's nothing worse you can do if you're suffering from infertility and to engage in a journey, to start traveling. It's very bad for health. It's very, right, there was this empirical understanding, but that's not the way to go. So it's irrational to obey God's command. Similarly with money, traveling is not good for your bank account, because you don't get a chance to work consistently at something and build up something. And it's not good for fame, shame. And it's in those three areas that precisely God blesses him. That's what Rashi wants to point out, that God, in a way, promises Abraham that the natural consequences of traveling will not apply in your case. That's the blessing I'm giving you, which is, again, a very minimal way of reading, a very objective, minimal way of reading the text. It'll all be good. It'll be good in ways that you can measure and feel comfortable with, and so on. So what about not telling him where he's going? Look at the last passage in Rashi, in number 1. Are we all together? Asher ar'eka, which I will show you. Lo gilalo haaretz miyad. God didn't reveal the land, the name of the land, the destination, immediately. He didn't reveal it immediately. In other words, there's a kind of postponement here. In the Lech Lecha command, there is a suspension. Instead of being clear and giving Abraham all the information he needs on which to make an informed decision, whether to do this or not, a choice, God just omits to reveal. So God deliberately tantalizes, you might say. He leaves Abraham very much like the grass at the surface of the earth. Right? It can't complete its growth. And Abraham is here in a kind of stalled position where he doesn't know where he's going. What a paradox. Suddenly Rashi is giving us the full force of the paradox, not just on traveling is bad for your bank account, but really in terms of the inner world of Abraham. What is he supposed to be thinking? What is he supposed to be experiencing at this point? If it's not a question of traveling to a particular good destination, he's thrown back on some kind of irrational state, or some kind of unsettled state, something that he can't resolve meantime. In Midrashic sources, which Rashi knew, you have, for instance, the idea, it's an extreme version, that his contemporaries, Avram's contemporaries, regard him as meshuga, madness. That it's madness. Have you seen this old man who looks like a meshuga? Have you ever seen anyone who travels and doesn't know where he's traveling? Right? It's the first thing you do when you arrive at the airport is to look up at the board and make sure that the name of your destination is clearly, you know exactly not only when and so on, but there's no changes. It's an essential part of rational traveling. And here, it's not just that he doesn't reveal it, it's lo gila lo miyad. It's a decision by God to suspend information, to leave him alone with his imagination, if I can put it like that. A person alone with his imagination and his speculations and has to go deep into himself. If I can immediately resolve the question by looking up at the board, then I don't need to go into that area of anxiety where I have to kind of work at myself to try to think, what am I going to do with this? How am I going to live with not knowing? Right. So it's a very, very specific challenge here that Rashi already implies here. The question of why does God not tell him has been addressed in various ways. One is Ramban, who describes it like this. Have a look at number 2. Numbers 2 and 4 we'll look at together. What was Abraham doing in response then to, what did he do in response to God's command? This is the sentence before you have on your page actually. Haya noded v'holech migoy el goy umimamlacha el am acher. He was traveling, wandering, haloch v'noded. He was just weaving his way and wandering around all over the place, from one place to another, without any sense of moving towards something, not knowing. That's meshuga. That's the word meshuga. Shogeya has to do with wandering, with not having a straight course. And here, it's that sense of noded. Ramban is a very elusive commentary. Noded, I'm sure, personally, that he is thinking of the use of that word in the Torah before this. Who was noded, and it was a curse? Nad. Yeah. Navanad. That was the curse of Cain, to be a wanderer and that sense, that anxiety. And so Ramban puts that in there. I regard him as crusted with words that should have little footnotes next to them. That's poetry. That means that the words don't just mean what you think they mean at first. They have echoes of some kind. The same thing later, at the end, the same thing. He took his direction towards Eretz Canaan, but that's just because that's where his father was going. He had no conviction that that was the right place. He really didn't know. He wandered. Ki haya. And so that later, look at the end of this passage. It's later in Perek Chaf, it says, "Vayhi ka'asher hitru oti Elokim mibet avi." Avram gives an accounting of his early life to Avimelech, much later. And he says to him, it was at that period when God made me wander. Another word for wander, to'eh, with a taf, from the house of my father. I left my place in the world, and that's what God did to me. And then again, Ramban introduces a poetic allusion, just to make sure you're really working at this. He doesn't want passive reading. He wants you to feel deeply and connect with what he's describing. And so he quotes from Tehillim. The last Mizmor in Tehillim, where the psalmist cries to God, Ta'iti k'se oved, I've been wandering like a lost lamb, bakesh avdecha, please seek out, please find your servant. In other words, find me, I'm lost. Give me a GPS, give me a sense of where I am in the world. And that cry, Ramban just integrates into his passage without saying it's a quotation. He says, Hayat to'eh k'se oved. And any literate person knows, of course, what he's referring to. It's not esoteric for the reader he intends. For the reader is. And so you have that note of pathos and of lostness introduced into this, which has to do with Asher Areka, which I'm not showing you, right? Which I will show you means I'm not. Please notice that I'm not. And so then we come to the Midrash. The first Midrash, the important of 3 Midrashim that I'd like to share with you. We're about half time now. Vayomer Hashem al Avram lech lecha me'artzecha. It's the first Midrash in Bereshit Rabbah on lech lecha. Rabbi Yitzchak Patach, Shim'i bat, a quotation from Tehillim, Mem Aleph, Mem He. Shim'i bat uri'i v'hati oznech v'shikri amech uvet avich. Quotation from elsewhere, which is somehow connected with lech lecha. The Midrash wants to connect with lech lecha. What's the proof text? The other quotation from Tehillim. Listen, daughter, and see, incline your ear, and forget your people and the house of your father. Now, what has this got to do with Abraham? It's addressing a bat. Someone is addressing a daughter, a girl, a young woman. See, pay attention, certain kind of focused attention, and forget, right? It's contradictory in a way. In order to pay focused attention on what? You should forget everything you know. Beit Avicha, the house of your father, which is, of course, part of the Lech Lecha command. Leave the house of your father, which I think, of course, is the basis on which the Midrash feels it can apply this pasuk to Abraham. If you want a clear verbal basis, there it is, Beit Avicha, the act of detaching from one's past. It turns out, if you look at that passage in Tehillim, that it's addressed to a bride, a young woman who is leaving her father's house to go to the home of her future husband, which involves traveling. And it involves traveling into the unknown. And there is the pathos of the bride's situation. It's a joyful situation. Everyone celebrates the journey of the bride as she leaves. You know how in all societies where you have this mode where the bride is going to the home of there's tremendous rejoicing. But sometimes I feel in a kind of dark, in a kind of ironic mode, that it's a rejoicing to somehow get her over the terror and the anxiety of traveling, of leaving everything and going. Not only that, it seems to me clear that there is an erotic undertow, which the text in Tehillim continues. We'll see it as we continue. That she's going into a world of marriage to an unknown man, and marriage itself is something which is other than her. She doesn't know yet about desire and about beauty and about the effects of her. It's a different language that she's traveling into. And she's told, pay attention and set aside. I'd almost say there's an Oedipal theme here. This is a Freudian theme. Leave the house of your father. leave your attachment to your father. You're familiar with the terms of that attachment, even assuming that there's nothing perverse about it. Just the normal father-daughter contains in it something that there has to be sufficient maturity to move away from it and move towards the eros with the unknown. There's something, I have no image to attach to it. Okay. Continue here with the Midrash. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, what is this like? The parable, but someone who was over mimakom lemakom. He was traveling from one place to another place, right? No place is home. And he saw a castle on fire. Bira achat doleket. My famous Midrash. How many of you know the Midrash? Yeah. A castle doleket. Oh, two translations for this. In a way, it's irrelevant to our purposes because we can just choose one of them, and as if that was the only one. But I do want to point out there are two. One is that it's a castle on fire, and the other is that it's a castle well lit up with lots of lights and candles in all the windows. It looks lebendig, it looks full of life and order. It's obviously a civilized castle. And what does the traveler think? Well, it depends what you think doleket means. He said, would you say that this castle is without anyone in charge? There is no order keeper here. There is no one who is charged with keeping order in this place. Now, would you say that? That's the question. Tomar. In the Midrash on Avraham, over and over again, you get that form. What kind of question does Avraham keep asking himself in many different forms? Next week, in Yad Hashem, we'll see some more. He doesn't just say things, he asks, he wonders. Would you say that? Now that's a wondering form. Would it be right to say that the world is without anyone in charge when you see that the world is burning up? Right? I'm going straight to the analogy. Yeah. You see a world on fire and you think there can't be a God. Putting it very in our terms, but in this, there's no manhig. There's no one creating order because there's such disorder. Of course, if you bear in mind the other reading, it's that you see the order of the world. You see beautiful order. Everything is lit up. Obviously, someone's in charge. So then you couldn't say it. Tomar gets the answer, no, you couldn't say it. It's very obvious. But then why is he troubled? Nevertheless, he still asks the question. What moves him to ask the question? So what you have then, as the traveler is asking this question, yes, it sits alav bal habira. The owner of the castle peers out at him. There is just a flash of a look from the owner of the castle. Very important word, hitzitz, alav. It's not necessarily a kind of steady look. It's a kind of suddenly an impulse. Something points at him. The face of the owner of the castle points at him and says to him, Ani hu bal habira. I am in charge of the castle. No explanations of why the fire, why no one's doing anything about the fire. No explanations about anything. Just the briefest of introductions. It's almost as if you didn't need to have him say Ani, because the look would be enough. The look, it's a way of saying minimum information. Ani, that's it. And that's the end of that part of the Midrash. And then it's translated into terms of Avraham and the world without anyone in charge, and that God looks at him in this way and says, I am Baal Ha'olam. I'm in charge of the world. And then we go back to Tehillim. It's rather mysterious, this moving backwards and forwards between the traveler and the bride. We go back to the female bride. V'yitav hamelech yofyech, the end of the pasuk, right? Go towards the unknown, and the king will desire your beauty, kihu Adonayich, because he is your Lord. And the Midrash translates, the king will desire your beauty, liyapotech ba'olam, the king will have a desire to make you beautiful in the world. Now, that's already complicated. I can understand it's very simple and primal. You are traveling to a world of desire and beauty, which you might have mixed feelings about. I'm not a radical feminist in the sense of just seeing only the frightening side of this. There is also one's own eros to work with, right? She has some. It's not completely without the feelings of some kind. And her imagination to and fro, she is in that kind of worked upon state now, which the Midrash wants to attribute to Abraham, of a sense of going towards an otherness that he doesn't even have a name for, and he can have no idea of what it will do to him. And the aim in some way is to give him a self. That is, he is to leave his old self behind and to begin to develop from the depths the complexity of a new self, of a new identity, which has to do with that glance of God. Somewhere there's a glance of God that doesn't explain things, but in a way complicates things. Because it now means you have this and that. You have the fear and the sense of some kind of desire to see that, to know that. And the desire of the king is not just that you should be beautiful in a private relationship with God, but you should become beautiful in the whole world. That the whole world, your beauty should affect the whole world. Something should happen to you that will affect the whole world with desire. That the whole world will want somewhere what your being will now say to the world. And we're left, if we read this way, we're left up in the air. So what is it? He recognizes this is a way of describing Lech Lecha, the Lech Lecha moment, the moment when Avram came to know the one God. It's very far for instance, the Ramban. The Ramban, and I'll go straight to that passage in number 5. Very famous passage again, Hilchot Avodat Kochavim, the laws of idolatry. The Rambam deals with the question of who was Abraham before God said Lech Lecha? Why did God choose Abraham? That's the basic question. We're not given any sense of his inner life or of anything particularly heroic that he did. He's not even described as a tzaddik tamim, as Noach is, right? As a perfectly righteous person. No credits are given to him. All we know is his father traveled and stopped halfway and his wife was barren. That's everything we know. So in a way, he's a kind of neutral person. He's an unfigured self. No sex, he's something neuter about him. It's not the word I want, but blank. Yes.
Are you currently discussing?
Could you say it much louder?
Are you currently talking about how Ramban thinks Abraham, or just?
No, I'm just saying this is a general question. Yeah, that everyone deals with in one way or the other. So what does the Ramban say? Well, he had a whole history. He was, and just to say it very briefly, you're welcome to read it through yourself. It's a very important and graphic description. From the age when he was weaned, very young, he began to roam around in his mind. He was an internal wanderer. He was thinking and thinking, and he looked at the stars and the spheres of the heaven. Bottom line, he asks, who moves everything else? Who makes the whole world move? I see everything is busy moving and operating. Who is the prime mover? In other words, Abraham is, for the Rambam, Aristotle. But this was Aristotle, the philosopher, who asked these questions, philosophical questions, full of wonder at the unexplained nature of the world. So what makes it work? There's something invisible that makes it work. And you have to come to that conclusion in the end, that there is something. And that was Abraham's process. So it's Abraham as the pure philosopher, as Aristotle. There was no greater mind that had lived in the world for Rambam than Aristotle. Aristotle is his standard of intellectual supremacy. That's not Torah. That's something else. But and he begins to think, and he thinks and thinks in a kind of privacy. He doesn't, all his thoughts about the world don't reflect in the way he acts. He joins his society in all their idol worship, that he does exactly what they are doing, but privately, secretly, he's thinking away. He's just he's a pure intellectual. Until he comes at the age of 40, it's actually given the age, to the conclusion, ha'ikar ha'emet, that there is one God and nothing else is worth anything, and he shattered the idols, and there's a passing reference to that Midrash, but it's intellectualized. The Midrash about Ur-Kasdim, the one that children are brought up on, but there's nothing about it in the Torah, about how Avraham broke his father's idols, and he's hauled up for judgment and execution, and he's thrown into the fire, but he's saved, right? That Midrash, which is regarded as really one of the purest Midrashim there is, because there's very little indication. There's actually no indication in the Torah of this, but we will see next week how a slight indication. At any rate, the Ramban, the ultra-rationalist, acknowledges that Midrash, but bypasses it elegantly. You don't have to think about fire and all this. He's not a martyr. He was a pure philosopher, and God did a miracle for him because he arrived at the truth all by himself, without any teachers, without any, right? So there's a kind of cleanness to it, the cleanness of the intellectual life. None of the mess of real life is involved in it. You break all the idols, it's a pure. And in the end, he gathers many people around him, followers, disciples, as he travels, as he starts. And the idea then is that the journey itself, in the course of the journey, he will create souls, that many people will be attracted to him intellectually. It's a purely, they will come, they will listen to lectures, he will debate with them one-on-one. That's a very interesting detail. He'll have dialogues, each one according to his intellectual identity. He knows how to talk to each person according to his own intellectual level. And clearly there, in that description, there's a reference very specifically to Socrates. Socrates had these dialogues, where he disabused people of their illusions, of their various wrong views, stupid wrong views. Ramban doesn't spare us those words, tipshim, these words were completely wrong. And Socrates was so successful that the state got worried about him. He became a political danger. He is contaminating the minds of the young, they're away from their natural culture, the culture of idols, and his life is threatened, and he's saved by a miracle. So he is all but Socrates. He is Socrates who was saved by God. I think the reference is rather clear. And in the end, right, he teaches his children. He arrives in Eretz Israel. He teaches his children. Yishatal bilibam, right at the end there. Ha'ikar hagadol. What did he do ultimately with all these hundreds and thousands of students that he had? Alafim revavot. Right? Clearly, the Rambam knew a world in which that was the excitement. The excitement that drew large crowds was the excitement of philosophers who knew how to think and who directed people in their thoughts. That's at least in the Rambam's understanding. And this intellectual then goes on to write books, which is the natural conclusion of a scholarly career. And that's the Rambam. No mention of brides, no mention of complexity of deep experience, of fear and love, the opposites, but rather a kind of single-minded, almost clinical approach to the world in which the body just follows along after the mind has come to its conclusions. The body is not really important. The body is much too changeable and much too vulnerable to rely on. You don't look to the experience of the body for anything. It's very deceptive, and so on and so on. All the whole history of antibody thinking, and that's where we are with the Rambam. When we come to the Midrash, we have a very different sense of things. And here, have a look now. Think still with the Midrash we've been looking at. Look at what the Mea Shiloach has to say about it. Vayamar Hashem el Avram lech lecha. Again begins with a text from elsewhere, from Yeshayahu. Ki etzak mayim al sameh v'nozlim al yibasha. If I pour water on the thirsty and liquids on the dry land. There's an image, an agricultural image again. Don't get far from that. Of the process in which water meets what? Say it. I can't hear. Dust. And the characteristic is dryness. If the dust is not dry, it's as if the dust were not dry, if there were no thirst, then there couldn't be the meeting. You need two partners for such a meeting. You need a God. God says, I will put my spirit upon you because you are thirsty. That's the image. There are two partners. God doesn't just come and implant himself, as the Ramban says. The Ramban says that Avraham implants into the minds of others the truth. Now, implanting, I don't know if I'm not sure I'm right, but I think so, that implanting doesn't mean planting seeds. It means actually planting the plant, the whole idea, right? Without leaving much work to the other person, right? You are doing it. You are. And here the Midrash comes and says, no, this was the meeting of Lech Lecha. It was a meeting between a dry, thirsty person and the water of what the divine encountered him with. That's the work that then has to be done. Between a man who is in quest, and without any reason to say this from the text, right? You have to notice in a way how brave the Mea Shiloach is. Late 19th century in the Romantic period, as we know it from Western literature, European literature. And it's the Romantic period is a period which is very concerned with the meeting of two opposites. Starting with man and woman, right? Erotic love, self and other, and the fact that you can't have anything dynamic happening unless there are two sides to it. And one side is the dry questioning side, and the other is, and without either, then nothing can happen. What was he looking for, Avraham? Just have to assume he was looking for something, or God could never have said to him, Lech Lecha. He was looking for the root of his own life, Shoresh HaChaim Shelo, which is very different from looking for the prime mover of the spheres of the world. It's not looking outwards to nature. It's looking into an inner experience and not able to find a root, not able to find something that gives it nourishment and a sense of vitality and energy. Where is the energy coming from? If there is energy, then it's not coming from any clear direction. And nothing, he looks around and he tries things and he knows that nothing can really be called life. All the pleasures of this world are wonderful, but they won't do for the name of Chaim. He's looking for Guf HaChaim, the body of life upon which the whole world is created. And that's why God then says to him, Lech Lecha. Right, do you see it? It's about 5 lines down, 6 lines down in the Hebrew. Yes, Amar lo Lech Lecha, Hainu le'atzmacha. So Mea Shiloach translates Lecha not for you, but to you. Go into yourself. Your destination is inward, not outward. What will you find there in yourself? El atzmacha, le'atzmacha, to the real stuff that's going on in there. because really nothing of all the things in this world can be called life. You're absolutely right. That's what Lech Lecha is acknowledging, that he's right not to be able to put the label Chaim on anything, any phenomenon in the world. That won't do. But where will you find it? Not in an outer circle of the Aristotelian prime mover, which is way sublime and far away from the center, but right there in the center, which is in you. Ikar Chaim timtza b'cha v'ata tagil b'Hashem. Reading very intensely. You will be the one who rejoices in God. From Yeshayahu. What will rejoice in God? The you-ness of you. That's where it lives. And that's why the owner of the castle peers out upon him. Hitzitz alav bal habira. And this is a very fine reading. Instead of hitzitz elav, he notices, perhaps the normal expression would be he looked at him, elav. And instead the Midrash uses alav, as if to say, a look is not one-sided, which is so important. Yes, that the look of the gazer, the look of the other, the great other, means it's a kind of pointer. It's like pointing a finger to Abraham and saying to him, look at you. Abraham is looking back at God, and God is saying, where will you find me? In you. And so really, what he goes on to say is that the subject of fascination for Abraham in this reading is not the great and wonderful God who can do everything, the mega powers of God. It's the intimate, microscopic movements of you. In your questing, in your trouble, har amot libcha, the expression that's used, resh ayin mem. Resh ayin mem means like thundering, roaring, trouble, turbulence, in the turbulence of your inner world. That's where I live. If you want to engage with the divine in the world, with the theological, right, with those questions, then you should look in you. So we just said this is the romantic period in the rest of the world, outside the Ishbitz, the Ishbitz world where the Mea Shiloach had his people. But there is a sense, I think, very often that what goes on in the rest of the world is reflected in some way in that dense, intimate world of Jewish thought. And there is a revaluing of the human that you find in all Hasidic writings, but particularly these rather late Hasidic writings at the end of the 19th century. And what you have here, he wants to say is, right, what you should really do is not look outwards, but look with wonder at yourself. Be amazed at yourself. What should you be amazed at? You realize that you are the only person who is troubled in this way. Everyone else is living a straightforward life. They're going mimakom l'makom. They're living the sort of, incoherent life of moving from one place to another. They're not having any trouble with it. The interesting thing is, God says, I find you interesting. I think you should find yourself interesting. Something like that. That you are singular. Why am I talking to you? Why am I pointing a finger at you? Because of you. Because of the way you are. That you alone are troubled. That trouble is the seedbed of any answer you might come to. The kushiyah is already the answer. Right? It's very paradoxical. That's the end right at the end. Your question, kushiyah, is often an intellectual question. Have a kasha, yes, an intellectual question, a learning question. But he uses the word, I think, deliberately, somewhat ironically. It's not just an intellectual question. Right? It has to do with life itself. He's looking for life. And it says the process of agitation is itself the answer. which doesn't help us all that much. It leaves us still suspended if we're still looking for concrete answers. We want to be back in the Middle Ages, or earlier, and we want, the answer. That's not where the Mea Shiloach is. And he has fertile ground in the Midrash. He's not fighting the Midrash when he says it. In fact, his student, Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen, goes even further and says, Ani Baal Habira. When God says, Ani, I am, the Ani is you. That is, I am in you. That's very daring. It's going very far. If you want to know where I live in the world, there is no other place but you, because you're dry, because you're thirsty, because you want something. And that creates the need for work. You're willing to put in the energy, to have the energy then to work, to try to take these different elements and make something of them. There are various hints coming to you from the world about the divine. If I can just elaborate in my own language for a moment, that the divine speaks in hints, doesn't come and implant itself in us. Certainly now, I think maybe there are some people who have had religious experiences of such an overwhelming kind that there's no question about what they mean to them. But on the whole, it comes in the form of a siman, a hint, a remez of some kind. And that world of hinting is one, I'll just quote Wittgenstein on hinting. Wittgenstein's, someone asks him if he had ever read Kierkegaard, great philosopher, Danish philosopher. And he said, yes, I've looked at him, but he's too much. He says, I get hints. The way I think is, I don't want someone else's thought all chewed up. That someone else has developed a whole system of thought, and then I have to sort of take it on. I'm looking for provocations. I'm looking for hints, for things that just spark me and make me think and make me speak, make me come out with what's inside me. That's what I value. It's a marriage I'm looking for. It's an interaction of some kind. It's a chemical experiment of some kind. And he remembers some third-rate play he once saw, in which someone says rather senselessly, just one little line, nothing can hurt me. There's a bland, for some reason that got him. And somewhere there's a sense then that got him and made him think his rather abstruse thoughts. I mean, his thoughts are not at all simple, Wittgenstein's, but he is fired by flashes from the world. It gets things going, like a cue, a cue that sets processes in motion. And so otherness, things come from the other world, but in minimum form, and its otherness can then be taken in and taken on and worked with. You can make something of it. And that is the work that in the end is organic and is valuable and transformative, that can transform from the inside. So the Zohar translates lech lecha, not for your good and for your benefit, but letikuncha ulegormacha, for your reforming and creating. That is, it's for the making of you. Ve'escha legoy gadol. Midrash already reads, I will make you into a great nation. I will create you. You have yet to be created. And the fact that you feel that is what makes you a candidate for recreation. The fact that you know that the raw material is just raw material at the moment, and you want something to complicate it, to get it moving. Now that's an image of Abraham. It's an image of Abraham, which then one can take out into many, many other areas. The power of the question over the power of the answer. For instance, Rav Yitzchak Hutner, 20th century, a very traditional thinker, a Jewish thinker, talks about, this is in his volume on Pesach, Yud Zayin, talks about the human process, the human way of living in the world, as a movement from chisaron to shleimut, from not having to wholeness, right? To defect, from deficiency to wholeness, from night to day. Right? The day starts with the night and goes and then moves. You can't, the day is not fully day if it hasn't had a night before it. The question is more important than the answer. He has a lovely way of saying it, which I always have in me. He says, the truth is that the answer is more in need of a question than the question is in need of an answer. Yeah, do you get that? Yeah, obviously when we have a question, we look for an answer. There's an urgency there. But the urgency is even greater if you have an answer that threatens to implant itself in you and not create knowledge in you, because it's just, there's nothing organic. And so you need the urgency of a question. You need that provocation of energy to get the energy going, right? And he sees that then he uses the Maharal to make these points. There's a wonderful pasuk. Actually, I think we should go and have a quick look at two more midrashim. They're quite brief, but I think they will. Number 7. Yes, Bereshit Rabbah. Second passage in Bereshit Rabbah, following one from the other. God said to Abraham, Rabbi Yachyav Apatach, Lereach Shmanecha Tovim Shemen Turak Shemecha. Something from Shir Shirim about the pleasant smell of your oils, when your name is like poured oil. So it's a compliment to the beloved, smells delicious, and that has some kind of spiritual meaning, some kind of erotic, invisible meaning. And Rabbi Brachia, what was Abraham like? So Abraham, we're now looking for an image for Abraham, a material image, again, a sensual image for Abraham. That's what means dome, haya dome. Why do you look for and I think there's a little feeling about sensual, a kind of negative feeling perhaps about the word sensual for some people. I'm using sensual. I'm taking my material here from a French philosopher, Gaston Bachelard, Bachelard. And Bachelard writes about the depth experience of working with imagery, of working to try to understand the depths of being, the invisible depths of being, has to do with the material imagination. If you want to understand something invisible and impalpable, then the most powerful way to do it is find an analogy for it in the sensual world. And by sensual, he means not just sensuous. It's pretty, it's lovely to look at, beautiful shapes, beautiful forms. It's not, it's the inner work, the work with the material, with the matter. Yeah. That's sensual. Your hands, the knowing hands, the hands that are right in there doing the work. It's not beautiful on the face of it, right? Beauty is some kind of ultimate product, perhaps, but meantime, the real work. So in that sense, we have here the sensuality of perfume. What was he like? Litzlochit. He was like a flask of, let's translate it, perfume, of fragrant liquid, fragrant fluid. Mukefet samid petil. That is well corked and placed stably in a corner. So it can't move and it can't, it's stable, steady. But the problem with having it carefully there, it's very safe there, but it can't do what perfume does. And that's the way the Midrash puts it then. Its fragrance could not waft out into the world. So here are very sensual words, nodef, reach nodef. That's what's, it's invisible movement, it's impalpable movement, except for one sense. One sense can detect it. Otherwise, it's not noticeable. And it's a very small amount of, I like to imagine it as the kind of perfume that my mother had on her dressing table, and that's going back a few years. which was absolutely tiny. I don't think they make them like that anymore. And that was the ultimate in luxury, I was given to understand. Don't get me wrong, my mother wasn't that kind of person. She wasn't, someone who titivated a great deal, but she appreciated high quality. She liked things that were the real thing. And that, an intensity, a density of effect coming from this tiny little amount. Well, that's a spiritual, from sensual, it becomes spiritual. And so what happened here? But when it was shaken up, if you open up the flask and you shake it around and you agitate it, then its fragrance does spread. That's what God said to Avraham Avinu, right? Look at that. Taltel atzmecha. Shake yourself around. Taltel. Right? Tiltul is instability. I'll read a quick list of translations for it. To be homeless, to be decentered, to be banished, to be distraught, distracted, unsteady, deranged, traveled, to swing, to hurl, to exile, road fatigue. Road fatigue in modern Hebrew is taltelet. It's that feeling of aimlessness, and you're not going anywhere with that movement. You are just, it's energy. It's energy in a way senselessly, and then it has a kind of maximum effect. Right? The movement of Avraham's being and becoming, his constant becoming, the inner work, which is not a finished product, the effect on the world. So it's not necessarily lectures to large audiences in this understanding. It's just sheer affect. It's sheer al-kain alamot ehavucha from Shir Hashirim. That's why young girls have loved you. Talking there about the man and the woman, but according to the Midrash about Avraham. But Avraham is a love object, right? He arouses a certain kind of eros in the world. And that's what's created the whole monotheistic world. That there's a certain eros involved, a desire of some kind. And it comes from the work of a particular man who started it off, who began to hint to the world in that way. And finally, and almost in time, number 8, final image. Lecha tal yaldutecha. Lecha. What's lech lecha? God says to Avram, quoting, I'm not sure where that's quoted from, to you belongs the dew of your youth. Dew. Suddenly Avraham is dew. What's the story? Avraham was anxious, was afraid, and he said, would you say, again, that kind of question, wonder, would you say that I still have sin in me because I once worshipped idols all those years? So maybe that early experience is still there in me and I'm blighted by it. And God said to him, but those sins are for you in your work, in your experience, they have become dew. The sins of your youth have become dew. Because just as dew, poreach, there's another sensual word, it evaporates, it disappears, it flies away. So your sins fly away. Just as this dew is a sign of blessing in the world, indicates something to the world, hints something to the world, so you are a sign of blessing to the world. Now look what this Midrash has done with the text. The text says, has God blessing Avraham, and you will be a blessing to the world. Very clear. You people will bless each other using your name, as if everyone knows that you are a blessing. And in this Midrash, it becomes rarefied to the point where you are no longer a blessing. That's too big. I'm not going to talk about that. We can't deal with that. You will be a sign of blessing. People have to read you. People will experience you, and then they'll have to work on it. They'll have to think, what does that mean? And you are now a sign of something rather than the thing itself. Now that's a movement, a very serious movement. Right? It's a very different way of looking at things through imagery, through depth experience. the Shem Mishmuel, and positively last moment here, number 10, again, late 19th century Hasidic master, Gadol, says, what is this about the evaporating dew? He comes back to this image. And I think I'll paraphrase rather than reading. You can read it yourselves. What he says is this, that dew, what does dew do? It evaporates. What does rain do, for instance? Another form of moisture. It irrigates the ground, goes deep into the ground and stays there. It's heavy rain. It comes and it stays in the way. And the Shem Mishmuel says this. It's quite wonderful. Drawing on the Gemara in Ta'anit, which is just above. He says, God says to Israel, Yehoshua says to Israel, you asked for an inappropriate desire. Sha'altem shelo kahogen. The inappropriate desire quoted from Hosea is that he will be like rain to us. That's not appropriate. I'll give you an appropriate desire. I'll suggest something else. And that is, he should be like dew to you. God says in Hosea a little later, Ehiyeh katal liYisrael. So God gently corrects their desire. And the Shem Mishmuel then says, what is the difference? Rain falls heavily and v'nishar, and stays there. And in that sense, invades, right? The other invades and overwhelms. And the problem with that, he says, is then there's no autonomous activity on the part of the earth. The earth is just invaded, right? So here comes the earth has to be active. It has to be in a state of active passivity, if you want to put it like that. Ready for what? The mere touch of a dewdrop. Right? All it does is touch and fly away. Fly away means evaporate, poreach, in this sense. So you can't find any evidence of it afterwards. It's something that's the merest, the idea of the merest touch, which sets things going, things that you couldn't have predicted. Brings out the inner freshness of the grass. That's the way he puts it. As if grass contains potential for refreshing itself, for life. And the potential depends on a certain minuscule meeting, which can better be imagined as a touch than as seeing something, right? Something very deep and reciprocal. And that's the way that the Shem Mishmuel wants us to understand the Midrash and the mystery of the unpredictable meeting of something from the outside, which we call God, we call the divine, we call a message, which means in a way, mobilize yourself in order to receive this message. And so the Sfat Emet feels on good ground to say very simply that God said, Lech Lecha, to Abraham, even though Abraham hadn't proved in any way his virtue, the grounds for this. The grounds for God's illumination is the fact that he was ready to hear it. That is, God says this to everybody, but not everybody is agitated enough to hear it. Not everyone wants that. And so if it says, he says to Avram, that in itself is the credit that's being given to him, that it got through to Avram, that Avram responded to that impact, to that. And that's where we begin our story. The story that we will be looking at, I hope, through many difficult, complicated stories as we move through the Torah, of the meeting between the inner and the outer, the meeting between the self and the not self. Thank you. I think if anyone has questions, does anyone have questions that you'd like to ask in public, or else we can do it one-on-one? Yes, go ahead.
Similar to how
I have to ask you to speak a bit louder because, yes.
Similarly to how the rain is something that God didn't just give man without there being, that was part of the process of the world being formed. similarly with dew.
Yes,
Because dew is something that
Yes.
comes spontaneously.
yes, it comes spontaneously. Well, rain comes spontaneously too, but again, there is that sense. Yes, there is that sense of an inner consciousness of the ground. The ground has gone through the stalled growth. Something is not working, and that's what invites something from the outside. Yes, but that's very good that you pick it up. Because really, in a sense, if you think this material over, I hope you'll find that one part speaks to another part. Where nothing is kind of to be left behind in the earlier parts of what we said. It's really, there's even a poem by Keats, the first stanza of the Ode to Autumn, which was going to be the beginning of the class, but I just saw my beginning was stretching out so long that I needed to get to the material. But read it yourselves.
Can I ask you a
Yes.
connection?
The what?
So, could I ask you the connection with Keats' Ode to Autumn?
That's right. That's what I was just, yeah. And let me just say, read it yourselves. Look at the activity of the sun. The sun comes and fills all the fruit with ripeness to the core. Conspires with something inside the fruit. As we say, uses the word conspires, to fill almost to the point of sadness. Autumn is a time of joy and decay, because you get too full, and that's autumn, and then there's bursting and decaying, and it's too much wet, too much, right? In this case, it's the heat, which on the one hand produces much growth, but internal. Right? That description is a very intimate description. It's not just of look at the fields. It's look inside the fruit and experience the sun coming boring in and filling you up to the core. Nothing is left, right? So there's that mixed feelings about it, which is autumn. Autumn is mixed feelings. It's great beauty and lushness, but that's the end. Beyond that, we know what there is. We talk about his maturing sun. The sun brings to maturity, and you know what comes after maturity. So the double feelings, which is the nature of poetry. It's an ode to poetry. Okay, thank you. Please, if you'd like to say something, why don't you?
I wanted to ask about, you said about the castle on fire,
Yes.
and that means that there's no God.
No.
Oh, sorry, that means that the God, that there isn't someone in charge of the castle.
God says there is. But he says it.
Either the delectate is either on fire or it's lit up. And so if it's someone in charge.
If it's someone, if the question doesn't mean anything, because if the question doesn't mean anything, because clearly there's someone in charge, the castle is illuminated, then it doesn't go anywhere. But if it's the elected, means that the world is on fire, and God is here saying something about an answer to your question. I am the answer to your question, but where will you have to look? You'll have to look in yourself. In the material.
It's a provocation that someone is in charge, but there's a feeling of the unsteadiness.
Yeah,
because the castle's
yeah.
on fire.
So it's the two things, the two opposite things are brought into collision, and that could be very fertile. That could be fertile or not.
Okay.
Something like that. Yes. Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
I'm sorry. I have one more question. I'm so sorry.
Someone left their watch. Ah, yes.
Can I ask you one more question?